Riverton, a small working-class town tucked into the northern stretch of the United States, entered winter the way a weary traveler enters a long night, slow, silent, burdened. Snow lay in thick blankets on the crooked rooftops, and thin streams of smoke drifted from rusted vents like sighs released into the frozen air. At dawn and dusk, the main street echoed with the noise of trucks, scraping shovels, and the overlapping voices of immigrants from every corner of the world. Life here wasn't easy, but people survived, stitched together by routine and resilience. On the second floor of an old brick building, Imam Karim al-Hadi sat motionless beside a narrow window. The thin curtain fluttered with every gust of wind, letting in a pale sliver of winter light. It washed across Karim's face, drawing out the deep lines carved by years of war and displacement. His dark eyes, once bright with conviction, had dimmed to a quiet, haunted stillness. Karim had once been a respected scholar of Islamic theology in Syria, a gentleman whose voice brought comfort to many. But war had taken everything from him. His parents, his siblings, his wife, and his 2 young children. Loss after loss had hollowed him out until he fled to the United States, where he arrived not as the man he once was, but as the shadow of someone who had lived too much grief. The only light left in his life was Fatima, his orphaned niece. She was the one thread connecting him to a world that had nearly vanished. As long as she lived, he believed he still had purpose. But tonight, that thread snapped. The phone on his table buzzed. Karim barely heard it at first. His mind was drifting somewhere far from the present. But the vibration persisted, cutting through the cold silence of the room. He glanced at the screen. The number belonged to the hospital. A tightness gripped his chest. He answered. 3 words were all it took to shatter him again. "We're very sorry." Fatima was gone. Her fragile heart had failed before the surgery. They desperately needed surgery. He'd tried desperately to fund through charity requests, odd jobs, anything. This time, there were no tears. The grief was too vast for tears. It was a grief so heavy, it pressed all breath from the room. Karim rose, pulled on his thin coat, and walked out into the biting wind. The cold assaulted him, but he felt none of it. He walked blindly down Riverton's dim streets, past flickering neon signs and shuttered shops. Snow crunched underfoot, the world sounding distant and muted, as if wrapped in cotton. One question pounded endlessly in his skull. Why would God allow this? An imam, who had devoted his life to faith, a child who had harmed no one. What justice was there in such cruelty? Anger began to flicker beneath the grief, a flame growing hotter with each step. Karim kept walking until he wandered behind a small corner grocery store, barely noticing where his feet led him. The store belonged to Rosa Martinez, a Mexican Catholic woman known around town for her kindness and her laugh that warmed even the coldest days. But tonight, the shop was closed, and the alley behind it was quiet. Something rolled under Karim's boot. He looked down. A small porcelain statue of the Virgin Mary lay half buried in snow, fallen from a box of discarded items behind the store. He bent to pick it up. In the moonlight, the tiny figure glowed, a mother cradling sorrow, a face carved with gentleness. For a moment, Karim stared at her, transfixed by the strange familiarity of that expression. A mother who had lost her child. But instead of comfort, the sight tore something open inside him. "Mercy?" he whispered, voice cracking. He felt rage swell, raw and wild. "Where is your mercy? You took my family, and now you take Fatima?" The grief broke loose in a sudden violent surge. Karim lifted the statue and hurled it into the metal trash bin. It struck the inside with a sharp, hollow clang, echoing through the alley like a verdict. The sound snapped him back to himself. He stared at his trembling hands. Hands that had performed prayers, guided others, held Fatima through fevers and nightmares, and yet had just thrown away a symbol of someone else's faith. Shame, confusion, and despair collided inside him. Unable to bear it, Karim turned and walked away, his figure swallowed by swirling snow. He didn't see the warm light flicker on behind the store window. He didn't see the woman watching him. Rosa Martinez had just finished closing up when she heard the sound. She peeked out and saw the man, thin, exhausted, shoulders slumped beneath a burden she could almost feel, throw the statue into the bin. But Rosa didn't react with anger. She'd lived long enough to recognize pain in another human being, and what she saw in that man was not hatred. It was heartbreak, the kind that makes a person abandon reason. When he disappeared into the night, Rosa slipped on her coat and stepped outside. Carefully, she opened the trash bin. There lay the statue, dusted with snow. She picked it up gently, brushing off the ice with her sleeve. A few scratches marred the porcelain, but the figure remained intact. Rosa exhaled softly, not in disappointment about the statue, but in sorrow for the man who had thrown it. She looked down the street where Karim had gone. Some hearts, she thought, break so loudly that even silence can hear them. And she knew, without understanding why, that this was not the end of the story. The night deepened as Karim wandered through Riverton's snow-covered streets. The cold pressed against him from all sides, slipping through the seams of his coat, settling into his bones. But he did not feel it. His mind was a hollow chamber, echoing with grief, with rage, with questions he once feared to ask. He had walked for so long that he no longer knew which part of town he was in. Streetlights flickered above him like dying stars, their faint halos blurred by the drifting snow. His breath formed pale clouds in the air, but even they vanished too quickly for him to find comfort in them. His footsteps slowed when he reached the narrow alley behind Rosa Martinez's small grocery store. A single yellow light glowed from the window, casting long shadows across the piles of boxes and the metal trash bins lined up against the wall. It was then, in the dimness, that something small glimmered at his feet. He glanced down. A porcelain statue of the Virgin Mary, no larger than his palm, lay half buried in the snow. The wind had swept a thin veil of frost over her face, giving her an otherworldly glow. For a moment, Karim simply stared. The statue's delicate features, the bowed head, the gentle eyes, the hands drawn together in silent prayer, felt like an accusation he could not escape. A symbol of mercy, a symbol of compassion, a symbol of a God who had not heard him. He bent down and picked it up. The porcelain was cold, the same cold that had settled inside his chest. Karim turned the little statue over in his hand, the moonlight catching on the smooth curves of its surface. "Where were you?" he whispered, the words trembling in the air. "Where were you when my family died?" His voice broke into a rasp. "Where were you when Fatima begged to stay alive?" The weight of the statue suddenly felt unbearable, as if it carried all the silence of heaven within it, all the unanswered prayers, all the nights he had knelt, pleading for mercy. He looked again at Mary's serene face, carved with perpetual gentleness. To Karim, in that moment, it no longer looked like a face of comfort. It looked like a face that did not answer. A surge of fury rose inside him, fury at the unfairness of the world, at the cruelty of fate, at the God he had devoted his life to serving. It was a fury that burned too brightly for a man so tired, too intense for a heart so broken. His hand tightened around the statue. "This," he murmured bitterly, "is what your silence feels like." And then, with a sharp, anguished cry he did not recognize as his own, he hurled the statue into the metal trash bin. It struck the side with a loud, echoing clang, one that reverberated through the alley and through the hollow of his chest. The moment the statue left his hand, something inside him collapsed. Karim stood frozen, staring at the trash bin, as if the act had torn a hidden wound wide open. His breath fogged the air in short, unsteady bursts. The anger that had carried him this far suddenly drained out of him, leaving a deep emptiness behind. He had not just thrown away a piece of porcelain. He had thrown away the last fragile thread of faith he had been clinging to. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of that realization. Without a word, without even a backward glance, Karim turned and walked out of the alley. His footsteps were slow now, heavy. Snowflakes settled on the back of his coat as if trying to soften his retreat. He disappeared into the night. From the window of her small store, Rosa Martinez had seen everything. She had paused while locking up, her eyes drawn by movement in the alley. She saw the man thin, tired, trembling, holding the tiny statue in his hand. She saw him speak to it with a face etched in anguish. She saw him throw it into the bin with a force that came not from hatred, but from heartbreak. Rosa's heart tightened. She knew pain when she saw it. She had lost her husband years ago, had watched her own son struggle with addiction, had prayed countless nights for strength when she felt she had none left. So when she saw the stranger throw the statue away, she felt no anger, no indignation, only compassion. She slipped out the back door, her boots crunching softly in the snow. The wind stung her cheeks, but she kept her gaze fixed on the trash bin. Lifting the lid, she reached inside and found the statue resting sideways, bits of snow clinging to its robe. She lifted it gently, wiping its cold surface with her sleeve. A few scratches lined the porcelain, but the figure remained whole. Rosa looked down the alley where the man had walked away. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story, but she understood enough. Some souls, she whispered into the night, carry storms inside them. She held the statue against her chest for a moment, letting warmth return to the cold porcelain. Then she whispered a quiet prayer, not for forgiveness, but for healing. She didn't know it yet, but this single moment, this small act of lifting something someone else had discarded, would begin a story far larger than either of them could imagine. The snow in the alley swirled like drifting ash as Rosa Martinez stood quietly beside the trash bin, the small porcelain statue cupped in her hands. The warmth from her palms spread slowly into the cold surface of the figure, as though she were coaxing life back into something fragile. She brushed the snow off Mary's face with the gentleness of a mother tending a child after a fall. The porcelain was scratched, but intact. A little imperfect, yes, but Rosa had always believed that the things which survive being broken are often stronger than the things that never were. She held the statue up to the dim yellow light spilling from her store window. The Virgin's face appeared peaceful despite the scuffs. Eyes lowered, hands folded, a posture that seemed to whisper patience. Rosa exhaled softly. This was not the first time she had picked something up after it had been thrown away, and it was not the first time she had seen a human soul cracking under grief. As she stood in the falling snow, Rosa's thoughts drifted unbidden back to a winter many years ago. A winter that had carved its own permanent scar across her heart. It was the winter her husband, Miguel, died. He had been strong, hard-working, stubbornly kind. He used to whistle in the mornings as he stocked the store shelves, even when business was slow. Life had never been easy for them, but they built their small world with care, brick by brick, prayer by prayer. Then came the illness, sudden, relentless. Rosa still remembered the sterile smell of the hospital room, the sound of machines, the way Miguel squeezed her hand even when he could no longer speak. She remembered praying, pleading for a miracle that never came. After he passed, Rosa had walked out into the same kind of winter night that now surrounded her. She was numb, hollow, a widow at 46. She had stared up at the sky and whispered, "Why him? Why now?" For months afterward, she could not look at a cross or a statue without feeling betrayed. Her faith did not break suddenly, it thinned, like a thread worn down by too much sorrow. Some days it felt as if God had stepped back and left her to grieve alone. So she understood grief, she understood anger, and she understood what it meant to lose faith. That's why, when she saw the man earlier, thin, trembling, his face twisted in silent agony, she had recognized something she knew far too well, the look of a soul on the edge. Rosa pressed the statue to her chest for a moment, warming it with her breath. Her voice was barely a whisper in the cold air. "No one should hurt alone," she murmured. This wasn't about being Catholic. It wasn't about doctrines, symbols, or rituals. It was something simpler, deeper, the instinct to reach toward someone who had fallen, even if he was a stranger, even if he had thrown away something sacred. Human pain, Rosa believed, was universal. It crossed languages, cultures, and religions. And so did compassion. She thought again of the man's eyes, dark, grief-stricken, filled with a storm she could almost feel. There had been no hatred in his gesture when he hurled the statue, only desperation. Only a wound so deep he no longer knew how to hold it. She wondered what tragedy had pushed him to that moment. What loss had hollowed him out so completely? She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he lived. She didn't know his story. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. He was drowning. And Rosa had lived long enough to know that sometimes the smallest gesture, a hand extended, a word spoken gently, a symbol returned, could be the lifeline that kept someone from sinking. She wiped the last bit of snow from the statue's robe and tucked it carefully into her coat, cradling it close to keep it safe from the cold. Her breath fogged the air as she whispered, "Rest a moment, Maria. We'll bring you home in the morning." She closed the store door behind her, locking it with a soft click. The warmth of the shop wrapped around her as she stepped inside, but she paused before turning off the lights. Through the window, she looked once more at the dark alley outside, empty now, except for the soft curtain of falling snow. "Whoever you are," she whispered to the night, "may you find light again." She didn't know it yet, but her simple act of compassion, one small kindness on a winter night, was about to ripple far beyond her imagination. For while Karim walked through the darkness thinking he was completely alone, there was a woman who had seen his pain and quietly decided he would not carry it by himself. Maria Elena stood for a long moment behind her shop, the cool air wrapping around her as she held the small Virgin Mary statue in both hands. The night had quieted, but her heart had not. She could still hear the hollow thud of the statue hitting the metal wall of the trash bin, an empty sound that carried a weight of grief far greater than its size. She wiped the last bit of dust from the figure's blue cloak, then drew in a steadying breath. It was time to return it. Ahmad had already locked the front door of his small apartment when he heard the knock, soft, almost hesitant. He froze. He wasn't expecting anyone, not at this hour. A dozen thoughts flashed through his mind at once. Did something happen? Did someone need help? Or worse, did someone come to discuss Fatima? He opened the door only a crack, but when he saw who was standing there, he pulled it wider. Maria Elena stood on the threshold, her warm brown eyes tender but weighed with a kind of understanding that made Ahmad uncomfortable. In her hands, lit by the dim hallway bulb, was the statue he had thrown away. His heart stopped. "Señor Ahmad," she said softly, "I believe this belongs to you." For a moment, he couldn't speak. Shame flooded him, thick, sudden, overwhelming. His throat tightened as if invisible fingers were pressing against it. I didn't mean—" "I know," she said gently, not letting him finish. "That is why I'm here." She extended the statue forward. Ahmad stared at it but couldn't bring himself to reach for it. The Virgin's soft features looked different now, no longer a symbol of God's silence, but a reflection of his own brokenness. "Why? Why would you bring it back?" he whispered. "After what I did?" Maria tilted her head, her voice never losing its calm. "Because pain makes us do things we don't truly mean. I've done the same." Her words struck him harder than any sermon ever had. Maria continued, her voice low, the memories pulling her back. "When my husband died, I was so angry. Angry at God, at the doctors, at everyone. I stopped praying. I even broke a rosary I carried for years." Her lips trembled slightly. Sometimes grief blinds us, but no matter how far we run, compassion always finds a way to bring us home. Ahmad felt his chest tighten. "I didn't run," he murmured. "I fell." "That's why someone had to help you stand," Maria said. She placed the statue on the small table by his door. She didn't force it into his hands, nor did she push him to accept anything he was not ready for. That gentleness, free of pressure or judgment, was something Ahmad had rarely encountered. "Señora Maria, I dishonored something sacred to you," he said, eyes downcast. "No," she replied firmly but kindly. "You expressed a pain so deep it tried to tear its way out of you. That is human. God understands more than we think." He swallowed hard. The words dug into him, unsettling something old and heavy inside. For the first time since he'd received news of Fatima's death, the sharp edges of his grief softened just enough to let in a breath that did not hurt. They stood in silence for a moment. Two wounded souls in a dim hallway, surrounded by peeling paint and flickering bulbs, but somehow the space felt brighter. Before leaving, Maria added softly, "You're not alone, Ahmad." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a proclamation. It was simply true, and that made it powerful. As she walked away, Ahmad watched her until she disappeared down the stairs. Then he stepped back inside his apartment and closed the door with a quiet click. For a long time he stood in front of the statue, just staring. He did not pray. He did not apologize. He simply let himself feel the sorrow, the confusion, the small, unfamiliar flicker of warmth he couldn't yet name. And in that stillness, something shifted. The statue no longer symbolized divine silence. Instead, it represented the kindness of a woman who had once lost her own faith and still chose compassion. For the first time in weeks, Ahmad whispered into the quiet room, "Thank you." He didn't know who he was thanking, Maria, God, or something in between. But it was the first leaf of hope to grow from the ashes of his grief. And it would not be the last. The next few days unfolded quietly, almost cautiously, like a wounded bird testing its wings. Ahmad didn't know how to explain it, but something had softened inside him since Maria returned the statue. Not healed, far from it, but softened enough for him to breathe without feeling like his ribs were caving in. Maria, for her part, didn't push or pry. She simply passed by his apartment door, sometimes with a warm nod, or waved when he stepped into her small grocery shop. It was the kind of gentle presence that didn't demand anything but still made the world feel less hostile. One afternoon, as the spring sun warmed the cracked sidewalks of their neighborhood, she motioned toward the small table behind her shop. "Tea?" she asked with a smile. Ahmad hesitated. He had spent weeks avoiding people, shutting down every invitation, every attempt at comfort. Yet the memory of her compassion tugged at him. "Yes," he finally said, the word surprising even himself. Maria brewed cinnamon tea the way her grandmother had taught her, slowly, with patience. The fragrant steam curled through the air, soft and calming. They sat on two mismatched chairs behind the shop. The alley was hardly beautiful, lined with old bricks, a rusting dumpster, and tangled vines climbing the back wall, but somehow it felt like a sanctuary. At first, they didn't speak. The silence was not awkward. It was restful, like two people taking shelter from the same storm. Maria broke it gently. "You seem lighter," she said, not healed, but perhaps breathing a little easier. Ahmad looked down at his cup. "A little," he admitted. "It has been a long time since I shared tea with someone." "I'm glad you're here," she replied. It happened slowly, almost unintentionally. One sentence led to another, then another. And before Ahmad realized it, he was speaking of things he had sealed away behind walls thicker than grief itself. "I'm from Homs," he said quietly. "Or, what is left of it." Maria listened without interrupting. "My wife died in the bombings. My parents too. My brothers. All of them." His voice trembled, but he pushed through. "My niece, Fatima, she survived with me. She was all I had left." Maria's heart tightened. "She was the one who?" Ahmad nodded. "She fell sick. Nothing dramatic. Something treatable back home, before everything. But here, without insurance, without help." His voice cracked. "I couldn't save her." The weight of those words hung in the air. Maria held her cup tightly, her eyes shining with sorrow. "Ahmad," she whispered, "I am so sorry." He bowed his head. "When I got the call, it felt like God finally turned his face away, that the last thread holding my world together simply snapped." Maria didn't reach for his hand. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply let him grieve. After a while, she exhaled softly and began her own confession. "You know," she said, "there was a time I thought God abandoned me too." Ahmad lifted his gaze. "I came to this country when I was 19. I barely spoke English, had no money, no family here. My husband Diego, we met in a factory. Hard years, but we had each other." Her voice softened. "Then he got sick. We fought for months, but in the end, I stood alone in the hospital hallway, feeling like the world had taken everything that mattered. She swallowed. I stopped entering church for almost a year. I was angry, more angry than I ever let anyone see. Ahmad listened, his chest tightening not from grief this time, but recognition. "So you understand," he murmured. "I do," she said. "Different stories, different worlds, but pain speaks the same language." Their tea grew cold, but neither of them noticed. Hours passed without the usual guardedness between strangers of different faiths, different cultures, different histories. Pain had carved similar scars into them both, and in those scars they discovered something unexpected: common ground. Maria smiled gently. "You know, Ahmad, sorrow builds walls around us, but sometimes it only takes one honest conversation to make the first crack." Ahmad let out a soft, tired breath. "Maybe that is what this is." "Maybe it is," she replied. The sun dipped lower, casting warm orange light across the alley. Ahmad felt something shift just a little inside the fortress he had built around his heart. A crack. A beginning. He didn't yet know it, but this small opening would soon grow into a bridge connecting far more than two grieving souls. It would become the seed of a community transformation no one in their neighborhood could have foreseen. But for now, it was simply two people sharing tea, sorrow, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone as they once believed. Word spread in unexpected ways. No one intended to gossip, yet the story moved through the neighborhood as naturally as wind moving through leaves. Residents whispered it to one another in grocery aisles, on front porches, in the narrow stairwells of old apartment buildings. Some told it dramatically. An imam threw a Virgin Mary statue into a trash bin. Others told it gently. A grieving man broke down, and a kind woman helped him up again. Versions differed, but the heart of it remained. Something tender had happened. The first person to approach Ahmad directly was Mr. Rosenberg, the elderly Jewish neighbor who walked with a cane and asked too many questions for his own good. He knocked on Ahmad's door one afternoon, wearing his most innocent smile. "Do you have a ladder I could borrow?" he asked. Ahmad blinked. Rosenberg had lived here 15 years and never once borrowed anything. Still, Ahmad fetched the ladder. When he returned, Rosenberg leaned close and whispered, "So, about that little situation behind the grocery store." Ahmad closed his eyes for a moment. "Of course. You heard." "Everyone heard," Rosenberg said proudly, tapping his cane. "People rarely talk to each other around here, but this has everyone asking questions." He patted Ahmad's arm. "You may not believe it, but what you and Maria did, it stirred something good." 2 days later, Pastor Michael invited both Ahmad and Maria to a small coffee shop at the corner of Willow Street. The pastor's enthusiasm filled the room even before he spoke. "I wanted to meet you," he said, practically glowing. "Your story reached our church before I even heard it from the source." Maria laughed softly. Ahmad sighed again. "It wasn't meant to be a spectacle," Ahmad said. "It isn't," the pastor replied. "It's an example. People argue about theology all the time, but grace, mercy, those speak louder than doctrine." They talked for nearly an hour. The pastor listened to Maria's recounting of the moment she picked up the statue. He listened as Ahmad described why he threw it, and not once did he judge either of them. Before they left, he said, "Folks are feeling safe talking to each other again. It's a start." Soon, small groups formed around the story. A few Muslim men stopped Ahmad outside the laundromat, asking if he was all right. A Catholic woman visited Maria and hugged her for showing what faith truly means. A young interfaith couple admitted the incident eased their fear of judgment. Even the teenagers loitering outside the corner deli whispered about the imam and the lady with the statue. Conversations sprouted like spring plants breaking through concrete. People slowed down instead of rushing past one another. Smiles lingered longer. Greetings became natural rather than forced. It wasn't that they suddenly became close friends, but the distance between them began to shrink. One evening on his walk home, Ahmad paused when he noticed an unusual sight. 3 neighbors, one Muslim, one Jewish, one Christian, sitting together on the front steps, sharing a bowl of grapes. They weren't discussing religion or politics. They were simply laughing. Maria appeared beside him, carrying a small bag of groceries for an elderly customer. "Do you see what's happening?" she asked softly. "They're talking," Ahmad murmured. "All of them." "It doesn't take much," Maria said. "Just a moment of kindness at the right time." Ahmad swallowed. "Or the right moment of pain." "That too," she whispered. For the first time, he felt something open inside him, not fully, not even halfway, but enough for light to enter. The story that began with despair had turned into a spark, connecting people who once moved past each other like strangers. And no one knew it yet. But this spark was only the beginning. Winter had begun to loosen its grip, leaving the streets of Riverton damp but bright under the early spring sun. Snowmelt ran in thin streams along the sidewalks, carrying remnants of salt and grit from the long months of cold. The neighborhood had not changed physically. Cracked pavements, faded brick walls, and chipped windowsills remained, but something intangible was shifting. Small acts of kindness were weaving themselves into the very fabric of the community. Ahmad walked through the main street one afternoon, carrying a bag of groceries for an elderly neighbor. He passed familiar faces, people he had avoided before, whose eyes now met his with warmth instead of suspicion. He realized, quietly, that he no longer felt like a stranger in his own neighborhood. Perhaps for the first time since arriving in America, he belonged somewhere. The story of the Virgin Mary statue had rippled outward, drawing people together in unexpected ways. It began with whispered conversations in hallways, expanded into brief encounters on stoops and in grocery stores. And soon, small gatherings formed. Neighbors, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish alike, found themselves coming together in the afternoon light, drawn by curiosity at first, but staying because of the quiet warmth that filled those meetings. Maria had suggested one afternoon that they gather behind her shop for tea. Nothing formal, she said, just neighbors, chairs, and cups. Ahmad had hesitated initially, feeling unworthy of such attention, but he agreed, realizing that isolation only deepened grief. When they arrived, the alley had been cleared of snow and debris. Chairs were arranged in a circle, and a small table held mugs of tea, pastries, and fruit. It was a modest scene, yet to Ahmad, it felt monumental. People who had avoided each other for years were now sitting together, speaking in low tones, sharing stories of daily struggles, losses, and hopes. Ahmad spoke first, quietly, about Syria, not in graphic detail, but in the human truths of loss and longing. He told them about Fatima, about the little moments he had cherished, and about the overwhelming emptiness her passing had left behind. Each word was careful, measured, yet full of emotion. His neighbors listened in silence, some nodding, others wiping a tear, all offering no judgment, only presence. Then Maria shared her story of arriving in the United States as a young immigrant, of hardship, of raising a family alone, of heartbreak and resilience. Her voice carried the weight of years lived fully, yet it also held laughter at small triumphs and gentle hope for the days ahead. For the first time, differences in faith seemed irrelevant. What mattered was the shared experience of surviving, of enduring sorrow, of finding moments of grace, even amid despair. Among those gathered were men from the local mosque, women from the Catholic Church, a few Jewish families, and even an evangelical pastor who had heard the story and wanted to witness it firsthand. At first, conversations were cautious, greetings were tentative, smiles shy. But soon, questions arose naturally. How do you pray when grief is so heavy? What do you do when you feel abandoned? Can compassion truly be stronger than fear? Responses came not as doctrines, but as personal truths. Ahmad spoke of leaning on prayer, not as an obligation, but as a lifeline. Maria spoke of choosing kindness over resentment. Others shared small rituals of comfort, lighting candles, reciting psalms, helping a neighbor with chores. The differences between them, the faiths, the languages, the customs did not vanish, but they no longer created walls. Instead, they became threads woven into a single fabric of understanding. By evening, the small gathering dispersed, but the effect lingered. Neighbors carried the warmth of human connection back to their homes. Children who had never played together ran briefly along the street. Adults lingered for a moment at fences, chatting about everyday matters instead of passing in silence. Ahmad returned to his apartment, feeling a quiet satisfaction he had not known in years. He paused by the window and looked out at the street, noticing faces he recognized, some waving, some smiling. For the first time, he sensed a rhythm of life that belonged to the entire community, a rhythm that included him. He thought of Maria, who had been the catalyst for this subtle change. Her gesture of returning the statue, her patience, and her unwavering compassion had done more than heal one broken heart. It had begun to mend the frayed connections of the entire neighborhood. In that moment, Ahmad understood a truth he had never fully grasped. Healing rarely comes in grand, dramatic acts. More often, it arrives quietly, through repeated choices to care, to listen, to reach across divides, and to honor the humanity of others. The statue of the Virgin Mary still rested on his table, its surface catching the evening light. It was more than porcelain now. It was a reminder that even in the smallest acts, lifting, returning, listening miracles could emerge. Ahmad closed his eyes briefly, whispering a prayer that was neither formal nor perfect. It was simply gratitude for Fatima, for Maria, for the neighbors who had begun to see each other as more than strangers. And somewhere beyond the alley, laughter echoed a sound he had almost forgotten could exist in Riverton. The first seeds of unity had been planted. And from these seeds, the neighborhood would continue to grow, branch by branch, until even the deepest divisions began to fade. The following week, Ahmad and Maria spoke quietly in the alley behind her shop. A plan emerged. Their goal remained simple: help those in need, create trust, and rebuild the neighborhood, one action at a time. Ahmad visited the mosque. He invited a few men, careful to explain the idea of small deeds connecting people. The men listened with interest. They nodded, ready to contribute. Maria posted a note in her store window. She wrote about gathering neighbors to clean streets, help children, and assist anyone struggling. The note did not mention religion. The note did not mention past grievances. The note focused on action and community. People arrived. Families, individuals, older residents, young adults. The street behind the grocery store became crowded, hands filled with brooms, rakes, trash bags, and shovels. Laughter rang in the alley. Children moved around adults, collecting litter and sweeping sidewalks. Ahmad observed quietly. Each smile, each nod, each conversation marked progress. Individuals who never spoke before exchanged advice about cleaning gutters, planting flowers, repairing fences. Names became familiar. Faces became friendly. Maria distributed tea and bread. Volunteers paused briefly to drink and eat. Stories emerged. A woman shared how she had struggled to pay rent for months. A teenager spoke about difficulties with school. Conversations unfolded without judgment. Mutual concern created understanding. A Jewish neighbor joined, bringing boxes of books for children. An evangelical pastor brought supplies for street cleaning. Muslim families arrived carrying garbage bags and tools. Ahmad handed out gloves and encouraged them. Coordination formed naturally. Tasks rotated. No single person dominated. Every contribution mattered equally. By midday, the street appeared transformed. The snow debris and winter grime disappeared. Flowers planted along fences brightened the dull walls. Walls still bore cracks, but the street felt alive. People paused to admire their work, laughing and clapping each other on the back. Small groups remained after tasks ended. Volunteers discussed plans for the following week. They spoke of tutoring children, assisting elders, sharing groceries with neighbors in need. Neighborhood connections deepened. Social divides shrank. Faith differences became background details, no longer barriers. Ahmad spoke to Maria quietly. "Look at them," he said. "It's different. Something is different." Maria nodded. She smiled gently. "It will grow," she said. "Every person who joins strengthens it." Evening arrived. Streetlights flickered on. Families returned home carrying supplies and memories of effort and laughter. Children waved and called to one another across fences. Adults lingered briefly, reluctant to leave. Ahmad returned to his apartment. He rested in silence, feeling weight lift from his chest. The Virgin Mary statue glimmered in the sunlight from the window. Its presence reminded him of the first gesture of kindness. Its presence reminded him of Maria. Its presence reminded him of possibilities. Neighbors began calling themselves Neighbors United. Meetings became regular. They shared schedules, divided responsibilities, and coordinated efforts to support each other. The mosque, church, and synagogue occasionally hosted discussions and workshops about kindness and practical aid. Stories traveled. A man received groceries he could not afford. A child learned to read with the help of volunteers. Elderly residents received help with repairs and winter preparations. Every small success reinforced the others. Optimism replaced caution. Trust replaced suspicion. Ahmad observed from his window, watching neighbors exchange greetings across cultural and religious lines. He understood something fundamental. Real change required action, not discussion. Real healing required presence, not lectures. Real faith required reaching out to others, even when uncertain or afraid. Maria stepped outside, carrying a small basket of pastries. Children ran toward her. Adults approached, offering thanks for her vision. Ahmad approached quietly. The sun fell across their faces. The neighborhood glimmered softly, shadows mingling with light. Ahmad smiled. Maria smiled. Volunteers worked in harmony. Streets looked different, alive, vibrant. Differences in faith, language, or background mattered less than shared effort, shared laughter, shared care. The first victories were small. The first lessons were simple. One person reached a hand. Another person accepted it. A street became cleaner. Children played. Adults spoke. Communities remembered kindness. Ahmad returned inside, closing the door softly. The room felt brighter. His chest felt lighter. The statue rested near the window, glowing in the afternoon sun. He whispered a quiet prayer. It was gratitude. It was hope. It was promise. The neighborhood, once divided, had begun to unite. Actions multiplied. Smiles spread. Conversations continued. Work inspired work. The spirit of Neighbors United became tangible. The winter past faded. The streets grew vibrant. People moved with purpose. Families became friends. Strangers became familiar. Connections strengthened. Hearts softened. A single act of compassion had sparked this. Maria had lifted the statue. Ahmad had returned it. Their shared grief transformed into shared effort. The neighborhood endured. It thrived. It healed. The days grew longer. Sunlight stretched across streets once shadowed by suspicion and silence. Children played in the corners of alleys. Neighbors greeted one another with nods and smiles. Small acts of kindness, multiplied by dozens of hands, reshaped the rhythm of Riverton. Ahmad stood near the steps of Maria's shop. He watched neighbors arranging benches for a new garden along the alley wall. Colorful flowers and young saplings lined the edges, carried and planted by hands of different faiths. Muslim families crouched beside Jewish neighbors, teaching children how to water the soil. Catholic women guided others in arranging flowers. Pastor Michael offered tools to those in need. Ahmad handed gloves and buckets, moving silently among them. Maria walked beside him, carrying a basket of fresh bread. Her eyes scanned the scene, soft with pride. The Virgin Mary statue rested inside her coat pocket, safe and intact. Its presence reminded her of the night when she first lifted it from the trash. "Look at them," Maria whispered. "They trust each other now. They care." Ahmad nodded. His chest felt light. He remembered Fatima, her laughter, her small hands, the way she had brightened his days. He allowed himself a smile, unashamed. Her memory fueled him. Meetings became frequent. Mosque leaders, church elders, and synagogue members attended discussions. Volunteers coordinated schedules for tutoring, street cleaning, and assistance with groceries. Youth groups organized after-school programs. Elderly residents received help with repairs, medication, and companionship. Disagreements appeared occasionally. Different perspectives, habits, and faith practices led to minor conflicts. The group resolved them quickly, guided by Maria and Ahmad's quiet leadership. Compassion became the standard. Mutual respect became the law. Conversations unfolded naturally. Stories of migration, loss, and resilience were shared. A Jewish man spoke of surviving war and displacement. A Muslim woman recalled her family's struggle to find work. Pastor Michael shared how small acts of kindness had kept him going during hardship. Neighbors listened without judgment. Silence was no longer heavy. Dialogue became healing. Connection replaced distance. Children laughed freely, chasing each other through the alleys. Adults shared meals on the sidewalks. Neighbors exchanged homemade bread, fruit, and cookies. A grandmother taught sewing techniques to teens. Teenagers read books to younger children. Everyone contributed. Everyone mattered. Ahmad paused near the small garden. A young boy handed him a sapling. He smiled and accepted it. The gesture reminded him of Maria's first act, returning the statue, offering compassion without expectation. One elderly man approached Maria. "You have done more than anyone could imagine," he said. "This street, this neighborhood, it feels alive." Maria shook her head softly. "They did it themselves. I only reminded them how to see each other." Ahmad knelt beside the boy and whispered, "You are planting more than a tree. You are planting hope." The boy beamed. Ahmad felt warmth ripple through his chest. He realized the grief he carried had begun to transform into something living, something tangible. Word of the transformation spread beyond Riverton. Local newspapers wrote small articles about neighbors working together, about interfaith collaboration, about a neighborhood rediscovering trust. Ahmad remained modest. Maria shrugged off compliments. The community, however, celebrated. Volunteers received acknowledgement, not as heroes, but as neighbors simply caring for one another. A local reporter asked Ahmad, "What inspired all this?" He looked at Maria, at the children, at the neighbors working side by side. "Compassion," he said, "and the courage to act on it." The reporter paused. Ahmad continued quietly. "Even a small gesture can ripple outward. Even grief can be turned into something beautiful." By the end of the week, Riverton's streets felt different. Voices carried across the blocks. Children played together, regardless of faith. Adults lingered on stoops, talking freely. Strangers had become friends. Differences still existed, but they no longer separated people. Ahmad returned home. The Virgin Mary statue rested on the table near his window. Sunlight gleamed across its surface. He traced his fingers over the delicate porcelain. He whispered a prayer not for himself, not for guidance, but for the neighborhood he had come to love. Maria entered with tea. She placed it beside him and smiled. They sat together quietly, watching neighbors continue their work outside. Ahmad felt a sense of peace he had not known in years. From grief had grown compassion. From a single act of kindness had grown unity. The neighborhood had become a living example. Faith and humanity could coexist. Differences could be bridges. Pain could become purpose. Riverton was no longer divided. It was alive. It was hopeful. And in every smile, every handshake, every shared meal, the story of a statue in a trash bin lived on not as a symbol of despair, but as a symbol of humanity restored. The morning sun poured over Riverton. Streets that had once felt cold and divided now shimmered with life. Children ran through alleys, their laughter bouncing off the walls. Neighbors paused to greet one another, exchanging smiles, that had once been strangers' gestures. The story of neighbors united had spread far beyond the neighborhood. Local newspapers called it a model of modern unity. Social media highlighted it as a blueprint for communities struggling with division. People traveled from nearby towns to witness the streets transformed by compassion, curiosity, and courage. Ahmad stood near the podium at a small interfaith event held in the community center. Leaders from the mosque, the church, and the synagogue were present. Volunteers, families, and children crowded the room. Cameras flashed as journalists scribbled notes. The air was warm, charged with anticipation. He adjusted the microphone and looked across the audience. His heart still ached for Fatima. Her absence was a quiet shadow behind every step he took. Yet, the presence of so many people committed to kindness reminded him of her light. He spoke slowly, letting each word settle into the room. "I lost my faith in the darkness of grief," he began, his voice steady. "I thought the world had turned away from me. I thought I was alone. One night I threw away a small statue in anger and sorrow. That statue could have been just porcelain. It could have been forgotten. Instead, one woman, Maria Elena, picked it up, cleaned it, and returned it to me. She did not judge me. She did not scold me. She simply chose compassion. That small act saved me. That small act changed everything. From that moment, my grief became purpose. My despair became connection. And slowly, our neighborhood became a community united by understanding and care." Applause filled the hall. People nodded. Tears shimmered in some eyes. The story had touched them deeply, not as a tale of religious difference, but as a testimony to the transformative power of kindness. Maria stepped forward beside him. She smiled softly. She had always been modest, always placing others before herself. The audience recognized her now not only as a shopkeeper, but as a symbol of simple, limitless love. She held up the Virgin Mary statue for everyone to see. Its porcelain surface gleamed under the lights. Ahmad continued, "Faith is not built solely from doctrine or prayers. Faith grows in action. Faith thrives in compassion. Every religion, every belief, every culture has one language in common: love. Love crosses all boundaries. Love rebuilds hearts. Love creates community." Journalists scribbled faster. Cameras clicked. The message echoed beyond the room. Local reporters would carry it into homes across the country. A story of unity born from grief, nurtured through human kindness. Outside the community center, volunteers arranged a small ceremony. Children painted a mural on a wall. It depicted neighbors of all faiths working side by side. Above them, the words were written boldly in colorful letters: "Love transcends all religious boundaries." Ahmad stood back and watched. He saw a young Muslim boy hand a watering can to a Jewish girl. He saw an elderly Catholic woman teaching a group of children how to plant flowers. He saw Maria quietly distributing tea and bread, smiling as if she knew this moment had been years in the making. He whispered to her, "From grief to light, from sorrow to hope." Maria nodded. "One act of kindness can ripple outward. Never underestimate it." The crowd gathered in front of the mural for a final photograph. Hands were joined, smiles shone. Cameras captured the essence of the neighborhood's transformation. People who had once avoided each other now stood together. Differences remained, but they no longer divided. Humanity united them. Ahmad raised his voice gently. "Let this be a reminder," he said, "that even the smallest gesture of compassion has the power to heal, to connect, to transform. Reach out, lift someone, listen, show love. That is how we rebuild the world, one person, one act, one community at a time." The crowd echoed his sentiment. Children waved, adults hugged. A gentle breeze carried the warmth of hope across the streets. From the shadow of personal loss had emerged a light shared by many. From a throned statue had grown a community united in faith, love, and action. Maria Elena had become a symbol of courage, kindness, and unwavering compassion. Ahmad had become a bridge between faiths. Together, they reminded the world that humanity's strength lies not in division, but in connection. The mural gleamed. The streets hummed. The neighborhood had become a living testament to the truth that compassion crosses all barriers. Join the movement. Choose kindness. Build your own community of love. Start today. Be the light someone needs.